Probably one of the questions I get asked the most often is about my palette. This is the palette I use and I've had it for 18 years. I can't even tell you the brand name. It's got some, the letters LT on the side and some Chinese writing. I can't read it. So I can't even tell you where I got it from or how long I've had it. But this is what it looks like when I'm painting. And the only difference right now from what it would look like when I'm painting and when I'm not is that right now it's dry. I haven't painted in a couple hours, so it's been sitting out, so the wells have dried out, the paint itself has dried out. Now let's take a look at my paint. These are tube paints that I've squeezed into my palette wells. Here's a couple tubes for you to look at. So these I squeeze into my palette. I try to keep color families kind of together, although over the years, you know, I had more yellows than I needed, so I threw a green in there, but it's green gold, so I can get away with that. So I have my yellows here, brown. There's a blue just randomly here. Again, it was a vacant space. Most of my blues I keep over on this side. Some darks and a purple, and my reds. And because I've used it for so many years, I know where the colors are and I stay pretty consistent. When I first add the color to the palette, it's wet and sticky, and what I like is when it dries to this kind of consistency. It's glossy and creamy at the same time, but it's not dried out like this one over here where it's kind of cratered and crusty. And different paints just kind of dry in different ways, and also the paints I tend to use more stay moister because I'm always brushing into them. Before I start painting, and the other thing is, when I'm not using my palette, I will let it dry. Usually it's just so it's not, so the wells aren't just dripping with color. And so I'll let it dry enough so that I can slip it into a plastic bag. If, you know, several weeks go by between painting sessions, it will dry out and get kind of crunchy like this one here, which is my burnt sienna. Before I start painting, the first thing I do is I grab a spray bottle and I mist all my palette wells. And that is the best way to just have your paint kind of ready to be used. And that bit of moisture on the top will kind of wake up the layer of color on the top of your well. So let's just look at this color here. Just kind of wakes it up, and just by brushing it a little, I can get lots of nice juicy color to use in my painting. The colors that have dried out, and like I said, they just will, especially if they're ones you don't use a lot, or if you start to run out, and you can see as I use my paint, I'm always stroking into the middle of my palette well, so it does tend to make a hollow and a hole. And but you can always, just because it's dried out and crusty doesn't mean you have to stop using it. You can just takes a little more time and a little more patience to just kind of brush in and wake up and pull out that color that you want to use. You're just pulling color off of that dried crusty bit, and then you can throw it into your palette here. You can see there's a little blob of color already in here. This is a color I don't use very often. I think it's Hansa Yellow Light, and when I'm using a color that isn't in my palette of favorites, then I'll just squeeze it into my well a small quantity and use it moist. The reason I don't use all my colors wet and fresh from the tube every time I paint is because it's kind of wasteful, I guess. I don't know if wasteful is the right word, but it does use a lot more pigment. So I prefer to use my colors mostly dry in my palette. On the other hand, if I want a really dark saturation of color, I will squeeze it fresh from the tube and get the richest tones from there. You do lose a little bit in saturation by using your paints wet or dry in your palette like this. Now, the other thing is, somebody asked me, what happens when you're painting, mixing colors, and you're using a light color and mixing it in your palette, and then maybe you want to grab some orange, for example, and you can see I haven't cleaned my brush. Yellow is quite light, so I'm going to go straight into my orange, go back into my yellow, mix a little puddle, and then, oh, I didn't rinse my brush again. So what's going on, Angela? Why are you dirtying your beautiful light colors with darker colors? And sometimes it even happens that maybe I was painting with purple and purple and yellow make a beautiful neutral. So I'm reaching into my yellow with my purple and grabbing some yellow with a dirty brush. And as you can see, it does make a murky little puddle in there. And I think if my pigment was moist and fresh from the tube, then I would have a problem because it would really mix. But what happens is you're always, when it's squeezed into your palette like this, you're always just using the surface of the paint that's in your palette. So I can easily, with a clean brush, go in and kind of sponge up that dirty stuff. And I do have to do that from time to time. Over here I was painting with my cadmium red earlier in the day, and you can see it's quite muddy and dark in there. I think I was mixing it with quite a dark green earlier today, because that red and this beautiful alizarin crimson mixed with a green makes a really nice dark black. So I can just go in with my brush and just kind of clean it up, lift out that color, blot it on a paper towel, and get it nice and fresh again. And it's really not hard to do. So I don't fuss too much about having a clean brush. Even when I'm busy painting and inspiration striking, it does sometimes happen that a dirty brush will go into a well of color that maybe it shouldn't have. And but you can clean it up. It's not the end of the world. And that was the last thing I wanted to talk about, was just my water. I have 2 water containers. I'll just try to pull them a little closer. I have a limited space here to work with, and that's why you guys don't get to see everything my hands do when I'm painting. So this is an opportunity for you to see how that works. When I am painting and working with a color, especially if it's a dark color, I always have 2 water containers. This is my cleaning container. So after I've been working with my dark green, for example, I'm ready to pick up another color, but I need a clean brush. I would clean it in this dirty water container. And then I rinse it in this clean water container. And that one's already getting a little bit murky. And so this clean water container is so important in my painting. I do not want to take from this muddy color when I am mixing, let's say, again, we're talking about our lightest color, so I'll go back to yellow. If I'm mixing with yellow, I don't want to grab this murky greenish color and make my yellow muddied by the color that's already in the water. So I'm going to want to take from my clear water, clean my brush, give it that final rinse, and then go into my yellow if I want a really pure color. Again, if I'm working with pale tones, soft blue, pale pink, you want the cleanest brush you can, so you're going to want to use your clear water for that. So again, it's pretty much a routine with me. Clean with the dirty water and then rinse with the clean. And if this water gets really murky, or if I want to keep this water super clean, I'll actually clean, blot out as much of the dirty water as I can, and then rinse. And that's another thing I'm often doing. When you take your brush out of the water, it's dripping wet. So I'll often just blot with my paper towel. And it's still quite wet. You can see it's glistening with water there. I don't want it to be completely dry or it just really slurps up a lot of color. I can actually clean my palette with a dry brush and get a lot of that color picked right up. But you do want to take out those little drips so it's not just completely sodden. So that's a little bit about how I work with my palette, and it may not work for you. This suits my style of painting. There are other artists who are religious about always using moist pigment straight from the tube. There are other artists who are very faithful to keep their palette much cleaner than mine, and insist on, just never using different brushes for different colors, for example. To me, there's a happy medium there. Keep your colors clean, but don't be so rigid in routine that you're stifling your creativity as you paint.